Thank you very much for having me. So my name is Mario Platt. I've been doing security stuff since 1998. I was 13 years old and hacking was fun. I've had a pretty technical career, about 20 years in security operations and engineering, and since about 2014 that I'm more focused on governance, risk and compliance, but I always made sure that I didn't lose my technical knowledge, so I still do a lot of Devsecops stuff, do stuff in CI/CD systems and all of that, and yeah, I like to do all of the above. So what we're going to talk about today is about an archetype-based model that I've developed through my consulting experience and working with different types of clients, big corps, government, and also startups, etc. And so I've created this archetype-based model to think about security and how we integrate security into people's work. A big buzzword is Devsecops, right? Even within security professionals, there's a bit of two schools of thought. There are the people that think Devsecops is a good thing, right? And there are people that say, actually, that's just distracting, right? I'm going to give you my opinion. It's the last slide, so I'm going to save it till there. But I think both parts of the argument have good reasons for it. Right? So on one hand, we have people that are for Devsecops, saying that it's actually a word that we can then, through it, access a body of knowledge that maybe if we didn't have a word to call it, maybe it wouldn't be as easy to access that body of knowledge. On the other hand, we have people that think that actually thinking from the start as DevSecOps and not just doing DevOps well, that should also be including security, may be an issue, right? Maybe that's not the type of message that we want to pass. By having a different word, we're saying it's different, and if it's different, maybe it's going to be done by someone else, and that kind of defeats the objectives that we're trying to have a DevOps process that ensures quality, one of the views of quality being security. Right? So I think both schools of thought have merit. And so that's why I've developed this archetype-based model. So in this, we have three types of characters in this archetype-based model. So on one hand, I'm going to start with Dave, the rainbow maker. So if you've been at this for a while, you may remember kind of a meme that's been going on in security for about 15 years, where you have all of the security controls on one side, and you've got Dave that clicks all the links, and yeah, and then there's problems brewing. So that's kind of a reference to that. So Dave as an archetype is about people that have incentives to go at speed, right? They're measured around how many features they build, kind of how stable their systems are, but all their incentives are like, yeah, we need to get this feature out the door, we need to make sure that we meet the customer because we've got a deal pending and this is going to help win that deal. So there's always that type of pressure that Dave, generally speaking, has a focus on speed, on making sure that things get to market. Then we have Rick, the gatekeeper, right? So usually the gatekeepers, and this is not just InfoSec, so obviously I'm talking about security today mostly, but it's about really any type of control function, right? So HR, finance, so any type of stakeholder that will typically have a focus on quality. However, their view of quality is typically a narrow one. Right? It's either secure or it's cost-effective, or they don't typically see quality as something that is kind of pervasive throughout the product, and it's something that is comprised of different things, right? Quality being different things. And usually Dave will have incentives on making sure that when we go through audits, you don't have non-compliances, that they manage the audit process well. So it's usually more of kind of a blunt-end type of activity, right? They're not in the sharp end writing code and doing the operational stuff. It's more looking from afar and trying to make sure that things meet that criteria of quality, that narrow criteria of quality that they define. Now, what makes the security unicorns different is that usually in organizations you will see a combination of stakeholders that are more like Dave and a bunch of stakeholders that are more like Rick, right? And there's issues in how they communicate. To the security unicorn, what they have different is that they actually found a way to make sure their quality and speed are mutually supportive and not they don't exclude each other. Right? It's the fact that they build the quality assurance into the process itself that allows them to go at speed securely, because they've built in the mitigations that give them the ongoing assurance that the quality requirements are being met. right? So it's mutually supportive, and that's kind of the big differentiator between security unicorns and the other teams, is that integration of quality and speed has been mutually supportive. So what we're going to do now is look at in detail at each of them and what are usually the characteristics of each of these. Now, one thing that I'd like to mention is that this archetype-based model works for both looking at individuals, right? So their predisposition to think about security a certain way, but also at groups, at organizations, right? So you may find that, for instance, in the engineering department, you have a lot of people that are kind of more like Dave, but the organizational processes are kind of optimized for Rick, right? They are kind of heavy. They are the spreadsheets we were talking about, the gates, all of that type of stuff. So the reality is always obviously more complex, but this is kind of the idea. You can look at both individuals and how organizations actually work. So usually when we talk about Dave and the Rainbow Makers, if you go ask Dave, right, the gatekeepers, what they think of them, you'll usually hear these kinds of words. And I've used kind of strong words on purpose, right, because I'm trying to pass a message here. Because when I've been both, so I've been a security engineer, I've been in risk and compliance departments, and I know how people talk about each other, right, because I've been there. And usually you will see these kinds of arguments, right, that they're negligent, they're stupid, they don't know what they're doing, they have all of these things. But usually what's actually happening is that they don't have situational awareness, right? They don't benefit from the feedback loops that would allow them to do a better job if they were just better integrated into their work systems, right? And that's what's failing them, right? It's the process, it's the social practices, right? So what the things that we do as teams, the ceremonies that we have, they are not assuring the security objectives, right? And that's what's failing them, right? So usually there are some essential characteristics into Dave, into this archetype. So usually you will not have, they will not benefit from this integrated security telemetry. Right? They submit code as part of their normal review process, and they get some unit testing, they get some end-to-end testing, or integration testing, whatever that is the case, but security isn't there. Right? There's nothing that tells them that there's something security related that they may have an interest on or that they may have to fix. Right? They usually avoid engagement with compliance, right? The compliance, they come with the policy books that were written by someone who was technical 25 years ago that probably doesn't understand modern development practices. So they tend to avoid as much as they can interacting with those people, right? Because most often they can actually get away with it. And there are also no secure baselines, right? So when they decide that they want to build a machine from scratch, they don't know what that machine, what the characteristics, what the configuration of that machine should be, right? So everything is kind of a one-off exercise of figuring out the specific need for that system, not how we can create kind of a baseline that everyone can benefit from. Now, the next one is not security-related specific per se, but from my point of view, it's one of the biggest things that organizations can do for security, which is if you don't have a way to have automated testing, if you don't integrate into automated testing for your functional concerns, then security cannot leverage that to also do security. Right? And I've tried. Well, actually, I haven't tried because I usually don't do that. What I usually say, look, first you need to fix your testing problem, and once you fix your testing problem, I can help you with your security problem. Because until you fix that problem, we don't have the tools to leverage, and it doesn't make sense for to be the security team to actually get you on the journey of automated testing. You need to do that because you want to build good software, and then we've got the baseline or the prerequisites that I can help you integrate security better. But until those are in place, that's not a possibility, right? That's not a strategy that is available to me. The other thing is that there's no product-level security reporting. Right? So I go into teams' backlogs, I can see all of the bugs that they have, I can see all of the things that they would like to do in the next 6 months, but I don't see security tickets, I don't see vulnerabilities, right? We're not leveling the playing field, right? And that's usually a problem, because if things aren't visible at backlog management, when the team is planning for the next sprint, there's no security stuff for them to do, right? If things don't make it to a backlog, then don't become conversations, right? And finally, usually they see security as someone else's job, right? So in most of these organizations that work more like this, security is seen as either the outcome of the pen test, so the penetration test, and now we're going to have 3 or 6 months of work of the things that were identified, and that becomes kind of my security program. Outcome of an audit, and the auditor says you need to do X, Y, and Z because you're not, and then that becomes the security things that you do, right? But it's always kind of imposed, right? It's something that comes from external. It's not something that the teams actively discuss and get a strategy for. So these are usually characteristics of this archetype. Then we have RIC, right? So RIC, they're not thick or business averse, right? They usually, the problem is that they lack understanding of control reliance, right? So what I mean by that is the way that controls used to look like when we were doing security on-prem, right? Which was largely bolt-on, let me get the security vendor, and then I'm going to get my encryption, let me get the incident product, and I'm going to get a SIEM security monitoring. It was always something that was, you go to the market and you buy that thing as a capability, right? It's not necessarily something that you engineer in, right? And that's the mental model that they have of good security, right? And that's where it becomes a challenge. And they usually have inertia due to past success, right? I could do a whole, I'll probably someday do a whole talk about this, but largely what usually happens is they are used to the way that they thought about security in terms of the different processes, the spreadsheets, the risk analysis, and the outputs to go into, and also the relationships that they have with security vendors, right? If you've got a long-term relationship with a McAfee, a Trend Micro, etc., they will want to keep on doing that, right? Because it's familiar, right? And the idea of, for instance, thinking about consuming cloud-native security capabilities becomes a bit of a problem, right? Because they really like their relationship with the vendor, and they'd like to keep it so, right? And that acts as inertia to change, inertia into adopting different types of engineering patterns that would be more beneficial to the organization. So usually, what happens with this archetype is that it's the team topology, right? What the security teams think their job is, right? Kind of what I usually say is the change between seeing themselves as requirement setters to being capability providers, right? The move from a project to a product, nurturing so the things that Will was showing us in terms of the capabilities of using Chekhov directly in CI/CD. So having an actual team behind that, making sure that false positives are managed, that when a new version comes out, that they test it before they implement it, right? Someone nurturing capabilities like a platform team does in 2020, 2022, right? They've adopted this mindset that it's no longer kind of the handover that we had kind of 15, 20 years ago, but they actually see themselves as providers of capability to make developers be able to go quicker, to go securely, to go in a more standardized way, right? And that's kind of the shift that largely hasn't happened in security. So those kind of team topologies, what they see themselves as doing for the organization, and also the poor traceability between what are the security requirements and what's actually on a CI/CD system, or what the feedback is, those are usually the things that are holding them back, the things that are failing them. So they also have a few kind of characteristics. So usually they expect gated processes, right? It's supported by committees, review boards, kind of we meet every 2 weeks. If you miss this one, look, in 2 weeks' time, you can come back again and see if we're talking about your thing. They usually have this limited understanding and trust of modern development practices in engineers, right? A comment that I heard a lot from kind of old school type people is, if I can't get people to care about security when they deploy code once every 2 weeks, how much worse will I be if they deploy 10 times a day, right? That's kind of, which kind of makes some sense, but yeah, that's usually the type of argument. So the policies and standards are also developed outside of the engineering context, right? So it's that idea that if people are just building security policies that sit on Word documents that engineers never get to see because it's not interesting, it's not on a format that they will typically deal with, usually you end up having this, schism between work as imagined by the person who built the policy and work as actually done by an engineer, right? And the more that we don't have the conversations on kind of align work as imagined to work as done, the more this creates kind of a business liability, right? Because our policies are saying we do one thing, but it's actually completely unrelated to how work actually gets done in the organization. And the last part is they usually lack the technical knowledge, or worse, they have outdated threat models. Right? They go on trying to help build cloud-native systems, distributed systems that are supposed to handle scale with the mental model of what an on-prem solution should look like. Right? And there's so much of that in the industry. That's one of my one of my main concerns, generally speaking, is the lift and shift type nature of big IT projects and all of that. That they are on the cloud, but they're actually doing on-prem on the cloud. They're not really thinking about different ways to develop and operate software. And then we have Stu, right? Stu and the teams, they're okay, right? They've got a good engineering culture, and they are a learning organization, right? I really like to use this specific set of words, learning organization, in the way that Andrew Clay Schaffer, one of the people that is kind of coined alongside Patrick Dubois to coin the term DevOps, the way that he talks about it, which is a learning organization becomes a graduate studies on the skills they require to be successful. Okay, I'm going to say that again because I think it's that important. If the only thing that you take out of this talk is this sentence, please keep it. Learning organizations become graduate studies in the skills they require to be successful. You don't just going onto the market, getting a vanilla type tester developer, etc. That's good. You bring people with skills. But in order to be effective in your organization, in your context, you need to become a learning organization. You need to make sure that when people come in, that you've got a program of work that will make them effective at working in your context. Right? And that's what a good engineering culture is. Right? And that's something that can be leveraged by security. So these compliance colleagues, they don't really work in silos, right? But they collaborate to establish the process, right? They collaborate to say, okay, we do these checks, we get these assurances, and then I can be sure that I can trust the process because I can see the outputs, right? I can go check that something's been done because, look, CI/CD systems, they're systems of record, right? I can go in there and see exactly what anyone did at any one point in time, right? So this learning about how to leverage the existing information to provide the assurances around security is kind of what the security unicorns do very well. Right? They work with the gatekeepers to establish process, and then there's an element of trust that the process is working, and they can validate that the process is working. So some of the essential characteristics of security unicorns is that security is embedded into their DevOps practices. Right? It's not something that comes from external. They've got definitions of ready, they have definitions of done, and they include the considerations for security. Right? It's not something that exists on a process that no one reads, that has nothing to do with their daily work. Right? It's embedded. So security is also an element of product and service quality. Right? As they manage bugs, as they manage end-to-end testing, performance testing, load testing, security is just another one of those. Right? It's just another element of quality. Teams keep up-to-date threat models. Their process has thought about the right security at the right time, right? So if, for instance, you expect to build your system on your pipeline in 15 minutes, what considerate security professionals should think is, I've got a 15-minute budget to do security testing, right? So what's the best use of those 15 minutes that I can do to ensure that my organization is as secure as possible. Right? So you use the constraints or the characteristics of the thing that you're building to build in security so that security doesn't become the bottleneck. Right? You think about it in terms of what everyone else is doing, and you see what's the best you can do with the affordances that you're being given. And compliance is code. Right? So there's been a process whereby these kind of random policy statements have been codified into things that can actually be used in the process, and they just act as another element of feedback when a developer commits code. Right? It's that simple. And usually these teams, compliance has less of a command and control type of approach, and it's more collaborative. Right? That's kind of the main thing. And we've got those people thinking about saying these are the objectives. Now I'm going to trust you and work with you for you to tell me what's the best way to make sure that your process gives me what I need, right? As opposed to, we've got 5 audit points and I expect you to deploy these 3 controls over the next 6 months, right? Which is kind of more normal of gatekeeping type organizations. So if we look at particularly the archetypes of the gatekeeper and the rainbow maker, then we can help them go up that triangle. Right? We just need to think about how it is and what's the next things that we can do to help them. So, as we were mentioning, lack of security telemetry. That's one place to start. We'll show us a few examples of using Chekhov, of using SAMGREP, of using all of those things that can help us kind of go up that triangle. So until there's enough feedback that teams know what it is that should be on their backlogs, we can't expect people to be doing security stuff, right? If it's not part of their backlog, it's not going to get done. It's as simple as that. So another element is thinking about where you manage backlog, your Jiras, whatever it is that you use. There's a way to filter for security stuff, right? That usually implies adding some labels, adding some fields, whatever may be the case. But what that allows is that kind of a compliance team can look if everyone is following the same categorization or the same labels, etc., they can not only have a view of security across the organization because they're querying everyone's backlogs that are using the same approach, but they can also allows them to, and this is something that I've done with a few of my clients and in other roles that I've had, it allows me as the security professional to sit down once a month with a product owner, with a tech lead of a particular team, and say, okay, so in the next month, what things of the security backlog do you think we can integrate, right? And it makes it easy to have that conversation because we're actually looking at a backlog. We're not just looking at some random spreadsheets or things that people are doing. Another issue is usually lack of security expertise by DevOps and software engineers, right? So another thing is security people are usually big on saying security is everyone's job, but we're usually not very good at telling them what that actually means, right? In terms of when you go to develop code, when you log onto your machine at 9 a.m. and start doing your thing, right? What does that mean, right? That security is my job now, right? And it's that part that usually needs to think about what's the minimum required security knowledge that everyone should have, as opposed to big things on awareness that are completely unrelated to the work that people actually do, right? It's maybe good for you not to click weird stuff when you go to a website, but it's not very good to inform how the engineering process should look like. Usually we've got poor process assurance, right? So you build a CI/CD system, you get things by default, and it's working and no one moves. So no one went kind of back to see, okay, was this built securely? Do we have the secrets in the right place, etc. And largely because security is dictated to them, right? It's the thing that happens after the pen tests, after the audits. They have no sense of agency and ownership for security, right? They have a sense of agency over features, over the things that they're measured on. And this security stuff is something that sometimes gets thrown over the fence, and they kind of rejiggle some of their plans over the next few sprints to deal with the things that were sent over the fence. Right? And these are ways that we can help Rainbow Maker type stakeholders or organizations kind of go up that triangle. The same thing applies to the Rainbow Makers, to the gatekeepers, sorry. Right. So the first thing is on assignment of security responsibilities. And this is something that I've been talking a lot in talks that I've been doing for the conferences in the past month or so, which is, to me, it's the difference between thinking about the work of security and the security of work. They're not the same. They're different things. Right? When we're focused on the work of security, we're focused on the risk analysis, on the compliance process, on all of those other things that are likely to be external to the things that people are doing. If instead we think about the security of work, right, what people are actually doing and thinking how we can make the things that they're doing secure, then there are different strategies that are available to us. We're no longer thinking about the bolt-on or the thing that we need to throw over the fence. We're thinking about the things that people do on a daily basis. How do we secure those, right? And that's a much better and a much more effective conversation to have. They usually spend money on the wrong things a lot, wrong technologies, things that are thought of that the product is good, but actually it affects the social practices that we've built around engineering in a way that is detrimental to velocity, to speed, etc. So there's sometimes not those considerations. They have expected processes, out-of-band approvals. You come to the committee, that happens once a month, and we'll talk about it. There's usually a command and control type approach and the inertia due to past success that we've already talked about. Right? So dealing with those things, which is largely about education, about showing these people that there's a way forward for them to keep their assurances without being intrusive into the engineering process, is usually the way to go. So, but all of this rests really on communication challenges, right? Usually in organizations, you will always have some kind of combination of gatekeepers and rainbow makers, right? That's usually the fabric of even a small startup. Even if you just have a COO, he will be someone that is a bit concerned about security, even if the CTO or the CTO organization isn't. Right? So you will always have some kind of these dynamics. So, and usually there's a problem with their management systems because they are either completely separate and it doesn't allow for good organizational sense making, right? So everyone's looking at their own screen and their screen is telling them different things because they work on different stuff. There's the stories that they tell and understand, and we'll go to what I mean by that in a minute. And the language that they use to communicate those concerns is also usually different. So this is something from resilience engineering, particularly the work of Richard Cook, and this is what he calls the above the line and below the line model. Right? And this is something that, from my point of view, is a model for empathy, more than anything, which is everyone, all of the work that humans do, cognitive work, happens above the line. We may think and we may talk about the things such as code, etc., but those are abstractions. Right? The real work is happening at the cognitive level, and everyone has a different view of what the system is. Right? We may even use the same words, right? But if I use the word as a gatekeeper and the word as engineer, the mental model of what we think that means is different. Right? And that's not a problem. That's a good thing, right? Actually, that's a marker of resilience. If you've got everyone reading the same books and thinking about the same way about problems, you're going to feel it, right? You're not going to be building good software. So that's a good thing. What the problem comes when that doesn't allow people to communicate effectively, right? And doesn't allow them to kind of think about the edges of those mental models, where they differ and what they refer to. Then we've got the stories that people tell themselves. They're different. Right? Gatekeepers usually tend to think at least yearly or 3-year cycles. ISO 27001, for instance, is a certification that is valid for 3 years. Right? So they usually think in these big time spans of the things that need to happen between one cycle and the other. If I'm talking to an engineer, if I'm going to tell them what I expect, what I need to have done in 2 years down the line, he's going to tell me, look, just go away and come back when it's closer, because I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do 2 years down the line. What I need to do right now is plan the next 2 sprints. Right? So the stories, the narratives, the types of uncertainty around outcomes are completely different. Right? Uncertainty to a developer probably means a spike. Right? You're going to test something, you're not quite sure, you're going to understand that. Within 1 or 2 sprints, that level of uncertainty will have faded away because you had spikes to explore that. If we're talking uncertainty at the director and the C-suite level, that's different. That's market conditions. That's what your competition is doing, right? The word may be the same. It's uncertainty, but they play at completely different timescales, and so they need to be managed with completely different processes. Right? And having an effective way to connect these different narratives in a way that is coherent, I think is a large part of what's missing in security, right? Is how can we connect what the engineers are supposed to be doing with practices such as threat modeling, right? That can be integrated into the engineering process and inform what people need to build in the next few sprints, with practices around risk management, which is more kind of multi-year cycles, or even to kind of wider sense in terms of strategy and understanding of complexity around Broadlight mapping and Connect framework, that we can think about what are the things we're trying to solve, where is the market direction, etc., that need to inform at the C-suite level. The stories aren't better or worse, they're just different, right? And the different people are interested in different stories. Then we've got the issue of language. Right? The language they use is different. If you get a compliance or a risk person into the room, they're going to come with a spreadsheets, with control testing, with testing procedures, what's the evidence, give me some screenshots, right? Those are all things that are completely uninteresting, usually to rainbow makers, to engineers, right? They're not interested. It's not the language that they speak. The same way, if a gatekeeper is talking to a rainbow maker and they're talking about code, about some of the artifacts, etc., they lose interest because they don't even understand what's going on. Right? It's not the type of story that they're used to. So this is another thing that kind of contributes to that barrier of communication. And my biggest pet peeve of all is what I usually call the uncontextualized policy syndrome, right? Where we've got people that were technical 20 years ago, right, building policies, etc., that are completely unrelated to how modern software development actually works, right? And that also brings with it its own challenges, because at the very least they're creating business liabilities, right? And that's not something that we usually like to have. So one way to try and address this is to think about how we can think about the artifacts and the standards that we use that make sense in the type of narrative and story that we want to tell. If you've got a standard such as OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, which is kind of the gold standard for application security, that's in a format that is good for gatekeepers, right? You can put it on a spreadsheet, you kind of tick box against it. It's familiar, right? It's the type of thing that they like to work on. But if you just hand over that as the document, this is what you need to do to a developer, it's a bit too abstract. They don't know what they do. Luckily, within OWASP, for instance, we have ways of dealing with that. You can make sure that your gatekeepers look at something like OWASP ASVS, and when it's time for them to understand what it means in the context of engineering, you've got something like OWASP cheat sheets that give you snippets of code in different languages, tells you how you tested, gives you testing procedures, right? And this is tools that are kind of readily available. These are open source that can be used to facilitate communication between these groups that talk in fundamentally different language. Again, it's thinking about process enabling communication. It's not people shouting at each other. It's artifacts, process, enabling communication, right? And that's usually the trick that is missing. So, but in order to help people actually go up this ladder, we need to meet them where they are, right? There's no point in that. I've seen people do that. Someone that is a complete security team that is completely into the gatekeeping, that if they could get away with it, they would have a code review and the pen test. Then after every code change, right? If they could get away with it, they would get it. That's what they do, right? Because that's what their mental model of good security looks like. Right? But just going in there and telling them straight away, what you need to do now is chaos engineering, right? Breaking stuff in prod and see how it goes. They're going to tell me, look, you're dangerous, you need to go away, right? And which is fair enough, right? It's so far out from what they think is possible or even plausible, right? That I'm not helping them if I'm telling you there's this, and that's the problem that I have with maturity models overall, is that people look at, oh, that's the level 5, and usually people look at level 5, and I can't see how this would work here, right? You're giving it too much, right? So knowing where people are and trying to help them giving the next step is kind of the way to go. So usually the constraint here is trust in both teams and process automation. And that's the problem for gatekeepers. So that's where we need to start. We need to think about helping them in a way that they can gain the trust that they don't have in the process and in people, so that they can then start letting go, right? And kind of having a different approach to it. So starting with threat modeling, policy as code for specific problems, right? So for instance, an example that I usually give is cookies. Most development processes get cookies wrong. They don't put them secure, etc. And that's an easy fix, generally speaking. Right? So getting some compliance as code, or looking at the last pen test and saying, okay, we've had these findings in the last 2 pen tests. Let's create some policy as code to deal with the issues that we found there. Right? That will allow you, after 6 months, after a year, to go back to that same person and see, look, that thing that used to come up in every pen test, it's not here anymore, because now our process is giving us immediate feedback when it's not done, and we're making sure that it's done as part of the sprint that we're working on. Right? It's not something that it will come back after the pen test as an item on the backlog for you to rejiggle. It's something that, because you've got immediate feedback, it can be dealt within the scope of the thing that you're building. Right? And that's how we can start building this trust in gatekeepers. Right? The things that they care about, let's codify them, and let's help them build the trust in the process. So that you can then think about integrating SAST and DAST that we were talking about earlier. And eventually go to completely blameless postmortems where we're just really worried about work systems. We're not worried about porting blame and saying, oh, that person did not follow the procedure. Right? Because guess what? No one follows procedures. And that's just how the world works. So thinking of this iterative and incremental way to help people is usually what I suggest that we do. And the same thing applies to rainbow makers, right? Usually their constraints are around agency and ownership, right? They don't feel accountable because it's not part of their, they don't have the requisite knowledge to say this is what we should do, right? So thinking first in terms of threat modeling with something like STRIDE, right, which is the mnemonic for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, etc. So teaching some basic language that we can talk about some security concerns. Or even using the basic four-question framework of threat modeling, which is, what are we building, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and how good of a job have we done, right? So a company that I've helped go through ISO 27001 certification, that's what they did. As part of the refinement process, if there was a new type of system that they were building, they would, as part of their refinement, they captured these 4 questions, right? And that was a security thing, right? For companies that are smaller, this is enough. This is get you started. Gets people with some sense of agency and ownership, and that's what's going to change in the fact culture. And then helping them things that they already do. If you're accountable for a Jenkins system, let's look at the security of your Jenkins thing, right? So picking up on things that people already see themselves as accountable for, let's help them make those secure, right? So that they can start feeling comfortable and having that ownership, right? And then helping them through the rest, implement baseline tooling, scenario testing, and eventually them either being part of risk analysis or completely owning their security backlog, where security teams are kind of staying back, just seeing how things are going in terms of trends, etc. And they have a more kind of an arm's length approach because they trust the process, they can see the outputs of the process, and they have no need to say, I need you every week on a call for you to tell me exactly what it is that you're doing, because I'm not going to be bothered to look at your backlog, right? Which often happens. But looking at artifacts isn't enough, right? We need to understand their interactions, and this is where a lot of engineering process, not even security, often goes wrong, which practices are really made up of meanings, right? We do a certain thing because there's a meaning to it, and there's some competences and some materials required. And what often gets lost when we think about just on the usual people, process, and technology is that these things, they're actually interdependent, right? You can't think of technology and process as completely separate things. It's going to go wrong, right? They're independent, they're mutually shaping. So we really need to think about what is the social practice that we expect to happen around this thing, knowing that they are affected by all of those things combined. And one of the main issues that often doesn't happen is evolving the meaning of practice, right? This is one of my favorite quotes from a business partner of Practical Devsecops that I sell a course on Devsecops for leaders through their website. And I love this quote, and I use it in almost every talk, which is, he says, in a DevOps world, a pen test is not for finding security issues, it's to improve process. Right? And for me, I think this is really a good marker. If you want to go back into organizations and think what people think about pen tests, this will tell you. Right? Because if a pen test is something that we do on an annual basis, that we get a few items on the backlog, etc., and that's it, okay, that tells me your organization works more like gatekeeping, right? Because it's that kind of assurance that is completely detached from the actual process. If the output of a pen test is going to generate an item in someone's backlog, that is then going to result in a verification of the mitigation directly into the process, that's when I know that you've got security in DevOps right? Because the meaning of the practice is that the output is supposed to improve process, not just for you to whack-a-mole whatever things came up in there. And this is all usually relates to the team topologies, what we're talking about, the issues around gatekeepers, which is a lot of security teams think they should be working over here, right, providing something as a service. They may even have security catalogs. But if you know team topologies, it's actually very hard to do that, right? Particularly if you haven't gone through a facilitation and the collaboration phase before. Because usually this will be riddled with assumptions that will not pan out, right? They are probably not going to work for you. So going back to first principles is really, look, you need to get the teams together to collaborate, see how each of the practices work, what are the best artifacts that can serve as communication bridges between them. Then after you do that high cognitive load collaboration work, you can move on to a facilitation method where there's a bit of more of a distance. Teams know what to do for themselves, they know the limits of their knowledge, and they know where to get help if they need so. Right? Or you've got a team, the security teams, instead of doing the risk analysis and say, I expect these 10 controls, the security teams are trained in actually facilitating workshops. Right? So they go to a threat modeling and they help facilitate a session as opposed to tell you what controls they expect to see in place. Right? And then finally, when you've got all of that kind of figured out, right, Then when you've got a experience, developer experience and management experience that is repeatable, it's expected, etc., then you're ready to think about providing something as a service, right? Because you're good at acceptance management, you know that the service is fit for purpose because you've been through the other two stages before, and you kind of know what you're doing at that stage, right? But most teams, security teams, they think they're there, they are on paper, but they don't have the characteristics of what it means to be there, right? And that's, the evolution of the team topology that we should mostly go back to first principles and then work from there. So, should you Devsecops or not? And we're about to finish. So, my view of what security in DevOps is that if you've got trust by the gatekeepers and you've got agency by the rainbow makers, then you've got secure DevOps, right? But if one of those isn't there, you will not have a secure DevOps process. Right? And it's naive to assume that the practices, the social practices, what people do, are there if we don't go through a process of actually figuring out what's the best way to build trust and what's the best way to provide agency. Right? So, and that's but I do think that at some point, calling it anything other than DevOps may be detrimental, right? Because it would continue to foster this us versus them, as opposed to, look, security is part of your job, as is any other element of quality, because you already know that every other element of quality is already your job, right? And that's sometimes the trick that is missing in security. So, going back to what I was talking about, I don't think the issue is necessarily one of practice. I think it's an element of meaning more than anything, right? Because the practices that are going to make secure DevOps or DevSecOps, whether they're done by a separate team that oils it well and has a good interaction, or it's done directly by people embedded within the teams and they just get some external support, I'm less interested in that, right? That's going to be very context specific. What works for one organization may not work for another. Right? In some organizations, it may make sense to upskill DevOps to perform some of these things. Other functions that have separate QA teams, maybe it makes more sense to upskill the QAs and get them a few of building these artifacts to build into the process. Other ones, you're going to have a big engineering, and actually it makes more sense to extract policy as code as a thing into a security engineering function that they provide these capabilities to others, right? All of these forms work. There are companies being very successful at security with all of the above. Right? So I'm less interested in the form, right? What I am interested in is on the meaning, right? In how people collaborate and what they see themselves as the outcomes and what the things that can be assured. So I think that the label has a strategic value, right? Particularly if you're coming from an old school type security team, using the word DevSecOps allows them access, as I mentioned at the beginning, to this body of knowledge, right? And maybe that's what they need to kind of start their journey into having different types of conversations around security. But we should develop the situational awareness to understand when maybe that word stops being useful, right? And if that happens, then knowing when it's time to move on and then start talking about security things in a different way. So and I see this a lot, if strategy mentions, the security strategy mentions the word DevSecOps, and we're not helping governance teams benefit from feedback loops, if we're not increasing the agency and ownership of security in a language that makes sense to other people that are doing actual work, if we're not focused on building the best possible developer experience to how security feels like in the organization, right? Is it something boring that I get the spreadsheets and I get the boring meetings with people I don't want to talk with? Or is it something that is part of my job and another element of how I build a quality product? And if it's not actively trying to break down these silos around the organization and connecting these governance systems so that people are kind of having a different view of, but looking at the same thing, right? So kind of when they look at their management systems, it's actually informative of what's happening in the other side of the organization, even if they use a completely separate one, right? If your security strategy mentions DevSecOps and is not doing all of these things, you're probably doing it wrong. And that is me. I hope you've enjoyed that.